One of the fun things about learning about wildlife in the city is that you have things that you wouldn't imagine live here. And then once you learn that they do live here, you start seeing them everywhere. And so with me, that happened with beavers in about 2013. I had heard that there were beavers taking down trees in Tacony Creek Park. I wrote an article about that for Grid magazine, and then it was left by magic. Once I knew that beavers were around, I started seeing their sign everywhere. Now to be clear, I don't see a lot of actual beavers. So we're not gonna see so many beavers walking around in the land, swimming around in the water. Occasionally you do. It turns out this morning I did get a quick look at one of them. But most of what you're gonna see, because beavers mostly come out onto land at night when we're not around, and then stay in the water the rest of the time, or back in their burrows or in their lodges, is you're gonna see their sign. Sign is a sort of fancy tracking term for evidence that animals leave behind of their activities. It can, classically be things like their poop, which you officially call scat. It can be prints and tracks. It can also be evidence of what they're eating. And so beavers give us a whole lot of that. Beavers eat a lot of things. All vegetation, they're vegetarians, but they'll eat soft vegetation like weeds, things you just think of as weeds around the water. They'll eat roots that are under the water. They'll eat cattail tubers and that kind of thing. They come up on land, basically to eat trees and also gather building material. They don't eat most of the tree, what you think of just as the wood. What they tend to eat is the inner bark of a tree, and then also the smaller twigs and the leaves that are higher up on a tree. So then that gets you to why they cut down trees. They cut down trees so they can get to the vegetation that's at the top, and then also to gather branches as building material for in the water. Beavers will build dams. This is classically what they're known for, is damming up rivers or damming up streams and building lodges. And they do that with wood that they harvest on the land. So right here we've got a couple stumps. This is one where you can see the beaver cut it down, and I'm not sure where the tree is now. We can't see it. It's probably in the water, right? They can cut down pretty decent sized trees and then drag them into the water, which is a pretty impressive thing they're big rodents. They're about 50 pounds, but still they can accomplish a lot. Sometimes they'll cut them down and you'll still see the tree down next to it, sort of assume that they got the leaves they wanted and then left it there. And then you got some trees that are kind of in the works. So here's one that a branch of this willow where they cut through it. Maybe it's kind of how it landed. It didn't really fall, so they didn't take the rest of it. One of the fun things is when you're around a place where beavers are really active, you can see trees that are sort of in all stages of processing, trees that they're starting to chew on, trees that they've cut down and have started working on, and trees that they've just taken down completely because all you see is the stump. We tend to think of beavers as living in lodges, building dams on streams, but that's not always the case. Beavers will sometimes build lodges and then spend the time when they're sleeping or hanging out in the winter inside the lodge where it's warm and cozy, but they will also sometimes burrow into the bank of a larger creek or a river. They also don't always build dams. So first question to ask is, why do they build dams in the first place? And it's because, in general, they're vulnerable to predators, right? So if you're a beaver, you might get eaten by wolves, you might get eaten by a mountain lion, you might get eaten maybe even by a coyote. When you build a dam on a smaller stream, it backs it up into a pond, and then right there you've got a whole lot more space to swim around in and do your business without being vulnerable to being eaten by something else. So then when you end up with larger creeks and rivers, number one, they might not even be able to build a dam all the way across it, but then they might not need to, just because they got enough water to swim around in, carry out their lives without having to worry about getting eaten by something else. In a creek like this, we don't see dams across the main branch of the creek so much. We've got beavers in the Delaware River, we've got beavers in the Schuylkill River. They're not building dams across the Delaware River, right? When you're out there and you see beaver sign, you might think, oh, but I don't see a lodge, I don't see a dam. Don't worry, they're still out there, and you can still see evidence of what they're doing. And so out along the water here, you've got a whole lot of branches, sticks, and they've obviously been stripped of their bark. The beaver, they eat a bunch of things, bunch of different kinds of vegetation, but a lot of what they eat is that inner layer of living bark on trees and branches and twigs. You can see what they've been eating in the water, where they've dragged branches into the water, stripped them of the bark, and then sort of they get left behind floating in the water. Another type of beaver sign that you can find. You might think, especially if you've lived in Philly a while, is this something new that we have beavers in our parks cutting down trees? The answer is kind of like yes and no. beaver in Philly sort of date back to millions of years before Philly was Philly, right? And then let's say around mid-1600s, the Dutch started trading with Lenape and other indigenous groups for beaver pelts to sort of trade back to Europe. That increased demand for beaver pelts wiped out beaver in our area by the time that Philadelphia got set up as Philadelphia by William Penn in the late 1600s. And so then if we really fast forward into the mid or early 1900s, by that point beaver had been wiped out in all of eastern North America for the most part. Game commissions like the PA Game Commission started releasing beaver that they had caught out west, and those beaver had sort of just an open field in Pennsylvania, and they started spreading all across PA, and it seems like they got to Philly by the 1990s, and then started getting a lot more common in the past 20 years or so. So on the one hand, it is kind of new. On the other hand, what we're seeing is an animal that has been part of the landscape longer than humans have, coming back and occupying the landscape and sort of picking up their place on the landscape and picking up their place in Philadelphia. And they can be hard to live with in some ways. Like if you're trying to restore forest canopy and you're planting all these trees and you spend a lot of money and energy on these tree plantings, and the beaver are just like yum and eat all your trees, that's really frustrating. We went through a lot of work for this. And so you might have to adapt by protecting particular trees you don't want them to eat. You might have to plant more species like willows that bounce back pretty well after they're cut down and eaten by beavers. But it's sort of a fun complement to our city, that we've got waterways that are clean enough, we've got parks that are in good shape, that the other great landscape architect of North America has moved back in and is sharing Philadelphia with us. And so I hope next time that you're out walking along one of our waterways, that could be the John Hines National Wildlife Refuge, that can be along the Delaware, the Schuylkill, Pennypack, the Tacony. We've got places all around, and we're in a relatively natural looking park. We've also got beaver in places like Penn Treaty Park, really well landscaped parks you might not think of as natural spaces, when you can find them there too. This has been partly a production of phillynature.org. Please check out phillynature.org for more information about beavers and other wildlife around Philadelphia. phillynature.org is a project of Nature Heroes. Nature Heroes also has live presentations as well, so come check out the website and learn more about that. Also, of course, this is a partnership with Grid Magazine. Grid Magazine is a local environmental publication, comes out every month. Please subscribe and help support local environmental journalism here in Philadelphia and get an issue every month. And last, I want to thank Chris Muller from beaversmatter.org. Chris has helped us out with a lot of advice. His website is fabulous, so check out beaversmatter.org. And I also want to thank him for some of the images we've used of live beavers doing things on land that we weren't able to see out today.